Hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's lecture on Cuban Americans. So the history of Cuban American immigration is basically told in terms of different waves. So the first wave takes place after Fidel Castro takes over the government in Cuba. The first to leave were professionals and politicians who had gained from the previous regime, which favored the interests of Americans and the wealthy. Many of these folks already had significant wealth accumulated outside of the island and thought that they had enough money to ride out Castro's uprising. So the original thought that was that Castro wasn't going to last very long. And so these folks went to places like Miami, where they already had investments and money in banks and so on, and thought that they could just stay there for a little while, wait Castro out, and eventually return to the island. This class was very familiar with Miami and the United States and were Americanized in some respects. They vacationed in Miami Beach and sent their children to American universities. Their children were taught English in their private schools in Cuba as well. Cubans who left identified themselves as political exiles, not immigrants. They weren't trying to leave their country. They were being forced out for political reasons. These Cubans left with tourist visas or student visas when they had visas at all. Castro knew these people were leaving never to return, but he didn't mind because he wanted the quote unquote gusanos or worms, those that he considered anti-revolutionary, out of the country, since they could potentially undermine his efforts. Once they left, if they didn't return by a given time period, their property would be confiscated. Those with technical skills and of military age, however, were denied exit. As these folks are arriving to the United States, particularly to South Florida, there were efforts to help these folks settle as they're arriving. The first group of organizations that attempted to help out were called voluntary relief agencies, or VOLAGs, which were primarily religious institutions, and provided a lot of the initial services helping them to settle. Significant downward mobility was experienced for many of these professional Cubans who came at this time, because they were unable to practice their professions, like doctors, lawyers, and so on, because they weren't licensed or trained in the United States. Women were able to find work more easily because employers could pay them lower wages. Many of these women worked in Miami's expanding garment industry at this time. These had been the industries leaving the Northeast, which were leaving Puerto Rican women unemployed in areas like New York. When this first wave arrives in Miami, they're arriving during an economic crisis or recession in Miami. So that when these folks arrive, they're competing with locals for the limited number of jobs at this time. As a result, some leaders from Miami got together and created the Cuban Refugee Committee to petition the government to resettle Cubans outside of Miami in order to ease some of the economic pressure of the city. Funding was provided to resettle Cubans to other parts of the country. Funds were also promised for their return to Miami if and when the Cuban regime toppled and they could return to Cuba. Resentment starts to grow among the local population in Miami. You start seeing signs that say no Cubans allowed. Others barred families with children from renting apartments. Resentment also mounted as Cubans received higher welfare payments than local residents, particularly African Americans. They also felt resentment because Cuban children were going to schools with white students, while their children, African American children, continued to be segregated. One local minister wrote, quote, that the American Negro could solve the school integration problem by teaching his children to speak only Spanish. Now, remember, this is happening in the very early 60s when the civil rights movement is going on throughout the South. And African Americans are fighting against segregation in their schools. And here these new arrivals arrive, and they're immediately allowed to go to school with white children. So it started creating these tensions and resentments between the Cuban and the African American community in Miami. At first, President Eisenhower's administration did not want to spend a lot of money on this population because he also thought that this would be over soon. And so he didn't see the point in investing in assisting this population if they were only going to be returning as soon as Castro was toppled. In 1960, however, the president has to respond to this pressure and creates the Cuban Refugee Emergency Center in 1960 to centralize the efforts of all of the volunteer agencies, and also to try to redistribute some of the immigrants to other parts of the United States. The official policy, however, was do not assimilate them. So the idea was that you didn't have to Americanize or try to assimilate this population because, again, the assumption was that they were going to return. So the treatment of this population was very different than other Latinx immigrants that we have talked about, because as we've seen, the ideal was always to try to Americanize these other populations, and that is not the case with this particular group. So, which means that in essence, they are able and allowed to hold on to their culture and language and so on. There's a significant amount of financial assistance that begins to be given to this population. Basil, shh, move over. President Kennedy comes into the presidency and has to start dealing with this population that is still here. He creates the Cuban Refugee Program in 1961, which provided funds not just for resettlement, but also for relief checks, health, education, and job training. They received more in their relief checks than local people did. Federal funding also went to programs to expedite the licensure of Cuban professionals so that they could practice medicine, law, or work as teachers in the United States. Low-interest loans were also made available for college. By 1966, the program had assisted more than 5,500 students. The University of Miami and the University of Florida created in 1973 intensive 18-month programs that assisted Cuban lawyers in achieving American law degrees. They had been assisted because they were fleeing communism, but also because the US administration thought that these folks would only be here temporarily. As soon as they succeeded in ousting Castro, Cubans were going to return. And so it was going to be beneficial to the US government and administration if they helped these people out, especially the professionals, because the assumption was that they would be grateful for the assistance they got while they were here. And then once they returned, these professional upper middle class folks would be friendly to US economic interests. Operation Peter Pan takes place as the years continue, and it becomes clear that Castro is not leaving as quickly as people hoped and expected. This program was created by parents who were concerned about their children being indoctrinated in schools into communist ideology and also military service. And so they created this sort of underground program to get their children out of the country, even if it meant that they had to be separated from their children for a time. Some of the children that came ended up in foster care, especially they didn't have any family members that could claim them when they arrived to Miami. The assumption was that the parents would be able to reunite with them soon. That didn't happen in all of the cases. Those in Cuba who were to get these children out of the country eventually were found out and served significant terms in Cuban prisons for their quote unquote counter-revolutionary activities. Eventually, the federal government made itself economically responsible for the children here in the US, providing funds and programs to help them find foster homes. For example, they help them learn English, get counseling to cope with psychological trauma of leaving their parents behind. The majority of the children that came were boys between the ages of 13 and 17, and approximately 14,000 children were part of this process. Even though many of the children were able to reunite with family members in Miami while they waited for their parents to arrive, in some cases, there were reports of inadequate accommodations, including experiencing physical and emotional abuse, especially in some of the foster care facilities. And in some of these places, they were punished for not speaking English. Now, the event that makes it pretty clear, particularly to the Cuban exiles in Miami, that Castro's not going away anytime soon, was the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Bay of Pigs was a plan to try to oust Fidel Castro, where the US government trained Cuban exiles that were living here in the US to go back to Cuba and oust Fidel Castro. The name of the regiment was Brigade 2506 and consisted of Cuban exiles. At the last minute, however, the Kennedy administration pulled the US air support, along with leaks about the operation, which took place, so that Castro was not taken by surprise and was ready when these folks arrived at the island. And was able then, his military was able then to very quickly subdue and capture these individuals. Castro captured an estimated 1,125 soldiers. These were arrested and kept in Cuban prisons. The community in Miami then turns its efforts to negotiate the release of the prisoners. The community in instance paid the ransom that the Cuban government was asking for to release these prisoners, dedicating themselves to raising funds and purchasing the different goods that Castro was in short supply of. So this was how they exchanged for the freedom of many of these soldiers. The Cuban Missile Crisis takes place when Cuba at this point, because it's a communist country, becomes very friendly with the Soviet Union. It becomes known to the United States that the Soviet Union has stored missiles in Cuba. Cuba being 90 miles away from the United States, this created a crisis situation where there was concern that Russia would be able to deploy these missiles to the United States. And so the way that this crisis was averted was through back channels, where eventually Kennedy and Khrushchev come to an agreement that neither country will invade Cuba. And so as a result of this agreement, travel is shut down between Cuba and the United States, making it a lot more difficult for people to leave the island at this point. The second wave is known as the Freedom Flights, which take place between 1965 and 1973. This takes place when Castro announces that Cubans with relatives in the US were free to leave the island. Immediately, Cubans in South Florida begin to rent boats to pick up their loved ones in Cuba. Even though the US government officials tried to discourage people from going on their own because of the dangers of the sea, but also because they wanted to be able to have some control over who was coming into the country. Eventually, the Johnson administration responds with an accord with Cuba, resulting in the Freedom Flights. Excluded from this agreement, however, were political prisoners, young men of military age, and those with technical skills. Priority to who could get on one of these flights was given to people who already had families in the United States, which fit with the US's recently passed Immigration Act of 1965, which emphasized family reunification as a purpose for accepting new immigrants. This also impacted the racial makeup of the second wave, since the majority of those who already were in Miami were white. That meant that a lot of, because of family reunification as a priority for who was able to get into one of these flights, it meant that many of the folks who came were also women, children, and the elderly. They also consisted of Cuban Jews and Chinese Cubans. Black Cubans, however, were underrepresented because the promise of the Cuban Revolution was supposed to benefit particularly the poor in Cuba, which were disproportionately Black Cubans. The response to this wave is similar to the first wave that we talked about. Newspapers were filled with complaints about the pressure on city services by having so many Cubans. One of the headlines read, "We are up to our armpits with Cuban refugees." The African-American community continued to complain that Cubans were receiving benefits of social and educational programs that African-Americans were at the time fighting for, and being beaten and killed through the civil rights movement. But services continued to be provided to this population. One of these services targeted Cuban women who were here alone. And this was through the Training for Independence program, where they received job training and at the same time were provided with childcare. It became a requirement in order to continue to receive aid to participate in this program. Bilingual education was implemented in schools in Florida for the children that were arriving to those schools. In 1966, the Cuban Adjustment Act is passed, allowing Cubans to more quickly change their immigration status to permanent residents or citizens. It cut all of the usual red tape that Cubans had to go through before gaining permanent status. This was to help professionals expedite their licensure and also to help the elderly to be able to qualify for benefits such as Medicare. There was a moment where we see a shift in policy from the no assimilation policy towards trying to get them to establish psychological ties to the United States, as it became clear that returning to Cuba was not an option. The third wave happens in 1980 through the Mariel boat lift. And there are a number of events that take place that lead to this moment. In 1978, Fidel calls for a dialogue between US and island Cubans, after which he would release 3,000 political prisoners. He referred to the community as, quote, the Cuban community abroad. So he changed his tune about this community. Because he was hoping to be able to get this community to send remittances or send food and goods and money to people in Cuba. The group that came together to participate in this dialogue was known as the Comité de los 75, which included Cuban exiles that were willing to return to Cuba to participate in this dialogue. However, the dialogues created tensions in the Cuban community, where some were against the dialogues because they refused to negotiate with the Castro regime. And some of these folks used violent tactics to intimidate those that were willing to go back to Cuba. And then there were those that were in favor of the dialogue and saw this as an opportunity for reunification with family members back in Cuba. This would have been the first time that they would be allowed to travel back to Cuba and to see people that they hadn't seen in many, many years. As a result of these dialogues, Castro releases 4,000 prisoners, more than initially agreed upon. As a result of the dialogue, Cubans were allowed to travel back to Cuba. The idea was that if you had Cubans go back and see the accomplishments of the revolution, that this would create better relationships. However, instead, what took place was called the Blue Jean Revolution, where many of the Cuban exiles that were returning to Cuba were bringing goods and pictures of the nice homes they had, the cars, the nice clothes they had, and so on. And this ends up raising discontent among Cubans on the island because they, for the first time, they see how much better their Cuban family members are living in the United States. And this discontent increases to the point where in March of 1980, 6 Cubans stole a bus and crashed it through the Peruvian embassy gates, looking for asylum and hoping that they would be able to get to the United States. This, however, results in a crisis situation, as you can tell in that image. Those are the gates surrounding the Peruvian embassy, and people were incredibly crowded there, waiting, hoping that they could leave the island. They were there for a number of days in overcrowded conditions. There was a lack of food and sanitation facilities. And Cuban exiles in South Florida began to lobby Washington for a response to this situation. The terms negotiated allow an airlift to transport Cubans in the embassy out of the country, initially to other parts of Latin America, but eventually the United States ends up taking the bulk of the people who were there in the embassy. This leads to tensions within Cuba between those that want to leave and those that stay behind, who see them as traitors to the revolution. And there's all kinds of tension and violence and so on that takes place during this time period against these people for daring to express the fact that they were not happy with the revolution and wanted to leave the country. So in order to address this discontent, Castro once again opens the border through the port of Mariel, and once again basically announces that if family members in the United States want to come and pick up their family in Cuba, that they are free to do so. Once again, Cubans in Miami found boats to come to Mariel to pick up their relatives. At times, though, Cuban officials forced these people to take more than just the members of their family. In addition, Castro released people from prison and those with mental illnesses to also be transported to the United States. The image there shows you one example of a boat that clearly is overcrowded, over capacity. This was happening with pretty much every boat that was arriving and leaving the island at this time. Many of these quote unquote supposed criminals that Castro had released from prisons appeared as such because before leaving Cuba, many were forced to sign documents stating that they were social deviants. Others went and registered themselves as criminals, prostitutes, and so on because they knew that officials expedited the paperwork of criminals. Others had quote unquote criminal records in Cuba for offenses that were not considered illegal in the United States, such as homosexuality, alcoholism, and gambling. The boat lift ceased after Castro closed the port in September of that year. Numbers of arrivals had started to dwindle as the Coast Guard increased its patrolling of the water and increased fines against Cuban vessels that were disobeying the law to go get their relatives. About half of the Mariel population was waited for sponsorship in 1 out of 3 camps established in Arkansas, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. And these were folks that were arriving without having any relatives or anyone in Miami to sponsor them. The response to the Marielitos was quite different than to the previous 2 waves. The news media emphasized the criminal and mentally ill element of the Marielito population, even though, as I just described, particularly those described as criminal weren't really people who had committed any crimes, but were using criminal categories as a way to get out of the island. Many Americans who earlier were open to sponsoring Cuban exiles that were coming without having any family members to stay with This time around, they had a lot of resistance to sponsoring these refugees, which is why they had to create these camps where to keep them while they process them. Most of these Cubans that came during the Maria boat lift were primarily Black Cubans. So the racial aspect to the resistance by both white Americans and Cuban elites was another element that was experienced by this population. The perception here shifts from these folks being political exiles to being economic immigrants. And by this point, as I mentioned before, the previous waves, Black Cubans were not coming. They had a belief in the revolution. They believed the revolution was going to fix their particular problems. Well, by 1980, it had become clear to them that the promises of the revolution weren't necessarily coming through. And so they were also experiencing the same discontent that previous populations had experienced, and was why they were willing now to leave to come to the United States as well. The images of this population worsened in the summer of 1980 when they rioted in some of the camps where they were awaiting sponsorship. They were particularly protesting the conditions in the camps. Communities petitioned to have camps banned in their areas as a result. There was a backlash against the Cuban population in South Florida, whereas before they were welcomed and offered assistance. In 1980, there was an ordinance was passed to repeal the bilingual bicultural ordinance that had been passed before to provide bilingual education for students. The negative impact of these images of Cubans led to Cuban Americans from the previous populations organizing the organization Facts About Cuban Exiles in 1982, whose goal was to educate Americans about the community and demonstrate the ways in which the community contributed to the United States. Even though this population did not have as positive of a reception as some of the other previous waves, they still received assistance from the government through the Refugee Education Assistance Act of 1980, which provided similar funding that was provided to previous exiles through welfare benefits, training programs, food stamps, and so on. In 1984, the Reagan administration came to an agreement with Castro that would take, where the US would take 20,000 Cubans a year in exchange for Cuba taking back over 2,000 criminal Cubans that had been assessed as criminals by the United States government as they were being assessed at those camps where they had been staying. The fourth wave takes place in the 1990s. As a result of the fall of the Soviet Union, Castro lost the economic support it received from them, and leading to a steep economic crisis on the island. And so he again began to threaten that he would open the borders to release the population and some of that pressure on his economy. There was a rise in social unrest in Cuba as a number of similar incidents as before with the Peruvian embassy began to take place, while there were others who were hijacking Cuban boats and taking these to Florida to pick up people. From January to August of 1994, 6,200 rafters were picked up by the Coast Guard. There was a rumor that Castro might do another Mariel type of situation. So Clinton, who was the president by this point, made it very clear that he would not permit another boat lift, and if necessary, would pose a naval blockade to stop people from coming from Cuba. Instead, Castro's government, their response was to just look the other way. So once Cubans on the island realized that nobody at their end was going to stop them from leaving the country, they began to come and makeshift balsas or rafts, as you see depicted here. Now, you can imagine crossing the ocean on something like this could be extremely dangerous. These are also shark-infested waters. And so there are many anecdotes about people who drowned, people who were succumbed to the sharks, and so there's a large number of people there are unaccounted for, because neither government keeps track of how many people have died in their attempts to get to the United States through these types of rafts. Now, Clinton attempts to have a hard line with these balseros. His initial rules were that Cubans picked up at sea would be sent to Guantanamo and not automatically be brought to the United States. Sending of remittances to Cuba was prohibited, and charter air traffic from Miami to Cuba was postponed indefinitely. Eventually, however, he does come to an agreement, the 1994 Accord, where he agrees, or the US government agrees, to take a minimum of 20,000 Cuban immigrants per year, and that Castro would agree to intercept balseros. So he would agree to stop looking the other way and start policing the borders of Cuba in exchange for the US taking 20,000 immigrants per year. The most recent form of immigration has switched from balsas or rafts to boteros, or people who are coming in boats. This is part of the result of the wet foot, dry foot policy, where Cubans are not deported if they land on the US soil, even though they have arrived illegally. That's the dry foot policy. However, if they're caught out in the water by the Coast Guard, then they are sent back. Those that arrive don't avoid capture by ICE because they are still under the rules of the Cuban Adjustment Act of 1966, which allows for them to remain in the United States as exiles and to receive the financial benefits of the previous laws. So because of this, part of what's happening is, or what was happening, was that folks in Florida were using boats to go pick up people in Cuba through professional smugglers to increase the likelihood of arriving to the US shore. So this was perceived as a safer way to try to make it to the United States than using a balsa. More Cubans arrive in the United States legally, however, than illegally, because of those previous accords where the United States government has agreed to a certain number of immigrants coming every year from Cuba. The most recent iteration of Cuban immigration is now flying or sailing to Mexico and crossing the Mexican border. So it's interesting to sort of look at what's happening at the Mexican border, where it's not just Mexicans and Central Americans crossing the border, but also now Cuban immigrants who are finding a different route to get to the United States. So this ends our lecture for this week. Hopefully you have a sense of why are Cuban Americans here, why are their politics typically different than some of the rest of the Latinx population. Many of them tend to be more conservative and have a large political influence, particularly in Florida, since there's such a concentration of this population in Florida. But this hopefully gives you a sense of why are these people here? Why are we so interested in Cuba? If you ever notice news and headlines about US relationships with Cuba, this hopefully gives you more of context of what that's all about. And how this particular population has come to be in the United States. So I look forward to your thoughts in the discussion posts. Have a wonderful day.